5,
4,
3, 2, 1, go.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm David Southworth.
And I'm Dara Patel.
And today we have our Halloween special. We're going to be talking about some spooky, scary, mysterious things in space. But first, as ever, we're going to do our space wows, things that have caught our eyes over the last few days. Dara, would you like to go first?
I can do. So something that I've seen in the news in the past couple of weeks is this idea of scientists have found 7 red dwarf stars that have an unexplainable infrared signature. And what I mean by that is they are glowing so brightly in infrared, there is nothing, astronomically speaking, that can explain why they are so bright.
So they go against our understanding of what red dwarfs are normally like.
Yes, and it's a little bit spooky in the sense that Halloween is filled with these kind of mysterious things, and these are one of these mysterious things that is just puzzling scientists at the moment. So if anyone's heard of red dwarf stars, these are red in colour, like we might expect. They make up about 75% of the stars in our galaxy and likely in the universe. So they're very, very common. But compared to our sun, they're much smaller. They're much cooler, which gives them that red colour. So we wouldn't expect them to necessarily be very bright in the infrared.
So because even though they're red, because they're less hot, they're cooler, they're giving off less infrared light usually.
Yes, so they've got less energy to give off, essentially.
Okay.
And this came about through a couple of different missions working together. So there's a NASA mission called WISE, which is studying the entire sky and looking at it in infrared. And there's an ESA mission called Gaia that you might have also heard of. That's also trying to map the stars in our galaxy. And working together, they've actually, from looking at about, I think it was 5 million stars, whittled it down by cutting out like false signals and interference and found these 7 that they're like, hang on a second, these don't quite make sense. And the hypothesis is, and this is where it gets a little bit like, well, I don't know about this, is that they might actually be caused, this infrared signature, by an artificial source. So an advanced alien civilization.
We love a theory like that.
So what they're saying is basically, have you heard of something called the Dyson sphere?
I've heard of it. I don't know much about it.
Okay, so the Dyson sphere is this idea that if we could build like a series of satellites and infrastructure around a star, we would be able to harvest its energy. So like having lots of solar panels and satellites all around a star, that you could capture all its heat and then use that energy. Now, in the process, you can imagine solar panels around a star would get very, very hot.
Yeah.
And so they'd also need to emit away some of that heat.
Okay.
And that would produce this kind of waste infrared signature.
And that might be a bit more focused than you'd get from a star, is that the idea?
Yeah, so the idea that it's harvesting it from a star, that it's only actually coming or being emitted from that one particular spot. Yeah. So what they're hypothesizing is that these 7 stars, these red dwarf stars that shouldn't be giving off so much infrared, may in fact be caused by an alien civilization that is so advanced that it's built a Dyson sphere around the star, and that star is now kind of, or the waste energy from that Dyson sphere is being emitted and causing that bright glow. And I'm glad you're laughing, because I also feel the same. I'm like, this is speculation,
it
right?
It seems ridiculous, but we can't know.
So this is the issue, is that nothing astronomically speaking can actually explain this at the moment, but they are going to need follow-up observations. So things like the James Webb Space Telescope, really good at looking at the infrared, will be going to sort of, hopefully at some point its cameras. We know that it's really limited on its time and where it can study these things. But there are also other theories. So it could be a star that is still forming, and they have that protoplanetary disk from which material forms. That glows very bright in infrared. So it could be that. And there's also something called hot dogs, which I've never come across before. Now, hot dogs are basically hot, dust-obscured galaxies.
Okay.
So the idea is that you've got galaxies obscured by dust. Dust glows bright in infrared.
Yes.
So it could be hot dogs instead.
Okay. They do sound more feasible, don't they?
Who knows?
As ever, we'll watch this space. We'll learn more by observing.
Mysterious, spooky
as we have through the history of astronomy.
So what is yours?
Well, it's probably less mysterious than that. But if there are any werewolves listening or watching, if you feel, I wasn't expecting you to be one. If you feel that the pull of the moon is stronger than you thought, we may have an explanation.
Okay.
So scientists have discovered, this is from a research paper recently published, scientists have discovered a very dense area under the south pole of the moon.
Okay.
More dense than they've expected.
Like under the surface?
Under the surface.
Okay.
So it's under a basin called the South Pole Aitken Basin. It's a crater, colossal impact crater, about 2,500 kilometres across. And under that, I'm going to read this because there's a number in here I need. They found a mass, a gravitational anomaly, equivalent to 2.18 quintillion kilograms.
Okay.
Absolutely enormous. And it's so dense, they think it actually pulls down the floor of the crater a bit.
Oh, wow.
So it actually pulls that crater down to be deeper than it would otherwise be.
Okay, so 101, anything that has mass has gravity,
Yep.
and this is such a big mass under the surface of the moon, under this crater,
Yep.
that its gravity is actually pulling the crater floor down.
And that goes against our understanding of the internal structure of the moon. So we weren't aware of this kind of thing. There's a couple of theories. One theory is, I think the main theory is it's the metallic core of a huge asteroid
Okay.
that collided with the moon, embedded under the surface and stayed there. But it does change our understanding, or that sort of slightly goes against our understanding of the moon's history and its geology, because that suggests that the lunar mantle was cool for a long period, that it could sustain it there, rather than dropping down to the centre, which is what often happens during the formation of bodies like the moon, like planets and so on. So, again, it's an anomaly, it's something unexpected. We're constantly learning new things about space, even things we thought we understood really well. But
That's a really cool, like the interesting thing about the moon, like you say, is that we know so much about it, but we're still finding things like this where we're like, I don't quite know.
So, again, watch this space. Well,
We'll
I'm sure
see.
we'll try and investigate more. We'll learn more about what's going on, and potentially, again, as ever, keep improving our understanding of the formation of these objects in space. So for our Halloween special, we're going to talk about some of those scary aspects of space. Some of them will relate to human spaceflight, and human spaceflight is scary. There are dangerous things out there. There's stuff that can kill you. So before we even start, we thought we'd maybe just quickly summarise what some of those dangers are that make space travel scary in the first place. Dara, do you want to tell us what some of those dangers are?
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I think we all kind of like create this dream picture of what it's like to be an astronaut, but it must be incredibly scary to be in space. And you're right, there's a number of different things that could pose challenges or prove quite difficult for astronauts. One of them is this idea that space is practically a vacuum. So it's not entirely empty. I think it's like one tiny little atom per, I don't know how much, but it's like there's nothing practically there. And what that means is that there is no oxygen for us to
So you
breathe,
can't breathe.
and there is no atmospheric pressure. Right now, we don't feel it, but the air around us is pushing on our bodies and it is providing a pressure. And without that pressure, our bodies would start to expand. Now, our skin is pretty good. It's quite elastic. And so, yeah, it might stretch out. But it's the liquids and the gases in our body that would actually expand quite dramatically, that it would be incredibly painful.
And you get bubbles forming in your blood, don't you?
Yes.
Which would be the first thing to kill you.
Yes.
I find the pressure one really interesting because people thinking about space who maybe don't know all the detail of this, nothing to breathe is obvious. We wear a spacesuit and we have oxygen tanks so that we can breathe. That's clear. Take away the atmospheric pressure doesn't immediately feel obvious, but like you said, incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, and some people on Earth will have experienced the symptoms of something like this. So deep sea divers that go down, the further you go down kind of below the depths of the water, the more pressure there is. Now, if you come up too rapidly, you experience that sort of same scenario of coming from a very high pressure to a very low pressure
And that's
environment.
the bends, isn't it?
It's called the bends, yeah. And it can be very, very painful, very severe.
And dangerous.
Yeah, no air, a vacuum is a big, big issue.
And then temperature.
Yes. Now, temperature is an interesting one because it can be very extreme. So we might think, space is empty, so it's really cold. And yeah, if you're in the middle of nowhere, it's practically close to, 0 degrees Kelvin. It's the scale that we use for temperature in astronomy. We're talking, below minus 200 degrees Celsius. Incredibly cold.
And that's the kind of temperature the James Webb Space Telescope instruments are kept at, isn't it? Because it's far enough away and shielded from the sun to keep that heat off it.
Yeah, I mentioned that it's looking at infrared. Infrared is heat.
Yeah.
And so you want to keep the instruments and your telescope cool enough that it's not detecting its own heat. So yeah, kept very cool. But you also have the extreme. So, if I was, heaven forbid, stood next to the sun, it wouldn't be pleasant either, would it? you get these extreme temperatures as well, and you're very close to something that's very hot, that giving off lots of radiation, that can be incredibly dangerous. And you don't even have to be close to the sun. So if you were
because
standing
even
on
in the
moon,
vicinity of the Earth where astronauts tend to go, it goes, I think the range is roughly from 180 degrees Celsius if you're in sunlight, down to about minus 110, I think, if you're on the dark side of the Earth in
kind
the shade.
of sounds like the right sort
Something
of,
like that.
the right kind of scales or orders of magnitude. And,
Yeah.
astronauts on the moon would have experienced this. They're
Those-
nowhere
yeah.
nearer to the sun, really, than the Earth is. But without the atmosphere to sort of keep the heat and retain a suitable kind of temperature, temperature is a big one.
Yeah, and you mentioned radiation as well, which of course we have to protect our astronauts from. Now, we've talked through that in terms of going to the moon, and I think that brings us very nicely to our first scary subject we wanted to talk about. This is one that I think probably people will be well aware of, but maybe there's a few details that we might be able to shed some light on, and it seems remiss to talk about scary things in space without talking about Apollo 13.
Yeah. One of my, and it sounds really bad to say it like this, but one of my favourite Apollo missions, because it just brought to light so much of what it takes to conduct a space mission. But yeah, this is one of the shocking stories of space, and thankfully nobody was, killed in the mission, thankfully. But there were some really close, near misses.
Oh, yeah.
And we can go back to even before the mission started. So Apollo 13 is the third crewed mission to the moon. It took off in 1970, and 3 astronauts on board. But actually, they had problems before they even lifted off. So anyone that knows the story knows that a couple of days into their mission, as they were heading towards the moon, there was an oxygen tank explosion. But that was actually caused on the Earth years before. So, in fact, there was the oxygen tank, and for many missions, the instruments are made, years before.
Yeah.
And they actually dropped the oxygen tank. It was only a couple of inches.
I didn't know that.
But it basically compromised some of the safety devices.
So I was aware that some of the devices, it's often small engineering flaws, the Challenger disaster, similar kind of things. But I wasn't aware of that they could pinpoint exactly what happened.
They only pinpointed it, I believe, after.
I'm sure,
So they didn't
I'm
realise
sure.
it at the time. But basically what happened is when they were testing it after it had been dropped, they filled it with oxygen, as an oxygen tank would be filled, and then it wouldn't completely empty. They couldn't completely empty it. And so what they did was they used sort of heaters to heat it up to completely empty the tank. But in the process, what they did is sort of burn away and compromise some of the wire insulation.
Okay.
And then as it got into space and that kind of equipment was then powered up and tested again, it basically caused a spark. And in the environment of pure oxygen, that's it. You've got an explosion.
And there's I only found out this quite recently. You and I were talking the other day about the film, Apollo 13, the Tom Hanks film. Fantastic film. Both
Love
of
it.
us. It seems as well to give quite a realistic depiction of that kind of situation in space travel. But one thing I found when I was reading up about this was it's what, and I think this quite often happens, it was kind of a routine process that was being undergone. So they weren't turning something on. They weren't using this oxygen suddenly. They were, I think they called it stirring the tanks. And that was a process that I understand they did just to make some of the meter readings more accurate, to keep it more consistent. And so it's really interesting, I find, when you have routine procedures like that have these unintended consequences.
It would, like you said, this would have happened anyway. And this idea of stirring the tank, basically, it's like a slush puppy. So when
That's a great analogy.
When you put oxygen into a tank, you're basically trying to fit as much as you can in.
Yeah.
Anyone knows oxygen in our environment is gas. And so what we need to do is we need to bring it to a low pressure environment where it's colder to fit more into the tank. So that's what they would have done, essentially creating like icy oxygen.
Yeah.
But like we have with a slush puppy, unless you stir the slush puppy or you heat it up, you don't get drinkable slush, right?
Yeah.
It just remains a clump of ice. And so routinely what they would have to do is, as the oxygen is drawn out to be used, it basically drops pressure and cools even more. And what you don't want to end up with is a clump of ice.
Yes.
And so what they need to do is they need to stir it and provide a little bit of heat to make sure that you keep that balance of it being at the right
So
pressure.
that's stirring, actually, so I'm slightly wrong with what I thought I'd read. The stirring is not just for reading things, for giving meter readings correctly. It is actually essential to keep the oxygen in a long-term usable state.
Yes, it's
Okay,
to keep it
okay.
at the right pressure and in the
That
right
makes me feel a bit
conditions.
happier about it.
Well, it was going to happen. They
Yeah,
would have
okay.
needed to do this, and unfortunately, at that point, it triggered that wire insulation, caused a spark, and caused that explosion. And it's just nuts that something like this happened. And you were mentioning actually the fact that they're very lucky that it happened at the time it did,
Yes.
because what they did was they ended up moving from the command module,
Yep,
which
where they
is
would normally
be
live
for that
on the journey.
for that journey to the moon, into the lunar module, which is only the bit that's kind of used to descend down
Yes.
to the lunar surface, which is only actually designed to house 2 astronauts, not 3.
Yeah. And for a relatively short period of time, just a couple of days.
Exactly. But had this happened before or after getting to the moon, after those 2 bits had separated, they would have had no lifeboat.
Yeah, because they used the lunar module as a life raft, didn't they? And they had to make all kind of adjustments. Lots of amazing engineering on the fly, making that filter out of things they had on board to allow enough oxygen for those 3 astronauts to be in that module. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Later on in the mission, no lifeboat available. They couldn't have made it home safely.
And I guess the last little bit about this is, even after that, the very last point of returning to the Earth after they made it, they didn't even know if the heat shield was compromised. That heat shield is there to protect them from the intense heat when they're driving down through the Earth's atmosphere. And in that explosion, who knows what would have happened to that heat shield. So yeah, scary stuff. But
Incredibly
the fact that
scary.
they made it back is just testament to the incredible engineering and feat of all the people involved in the Apollo.
Absolutely. If you've not seen the film, you definitely should watch it. It's absolutely
rated by
fantastic.
David and me.
So on to our second one, not completely dissimilar, probably a bit less well known. This was a fire on the Mir space station. So the Mir space station was constructed initially under the Soviets, but continued when the Soviet Union collapsed, and it was then a Russian space station. So it started being built in 1986 and was operating through to, I think, 2001, something like that. So a precursor to the International Space Station. A little bit smaller than the ISS, but a similar idea. It's a modular space station, so built from separate components while it's in orbit. And a lot of the learning from the Mir space station went into construction of the ISS. And I think even maybe 1 or 2 of the modules became the early
think one
modules
of
the ISS.
the core modules of the ISS was supposed to be like a Mir 2, and it kind of got taken and put onto the International Space
So
Station
a really,
project.
really important step in learning more about long-term space stations. It was the first time we'd had long-term missions to space, kind of 6-month missions, the same thing we do with the ISS these days.
You know what's really interesting is you're talking about a space station. I'm thinking, okay, an astronaut being in space, without a spacesuit, they're kind of in trouble. But actually, a space station feels like a very safe space to be. If you're going to be in space, like, I would want to be in a contained environment. So I'm wondering where you're going with this and what possible dangers could follow.
That's an interesting point if we go back to more general things, because yes, it does feel like it should be safer. But ultimately, a spacesuit is essentially a tiny spacecraft, a tiny space station. It's got all those life support missions, but life support systems, I should say. But it feels a bit more vulnerable. It's small. It's designed for a few hours. But a space station does feel like it should be more robust, and they are more robust.
Should be.
However, the Mir space station was coming towards the end of its life. It was quite old.
Okay.
Maybe hadn't been maintained quite as well as it should have been. I think that's true of the ISS these days, to be fair, as well. But it was astronauts and cosmonauts that were there had talked about it feeling quite shoddy, quite
run down.
Yeah, absolutely, really in need of a bit of repair. Things felt old, and to us, with not having been to space, like you say, we kind of think, well, a space station's pristine and beautiful and really, really safe, but not always the case. These things still need work, need maintenance, and need to be working properly.
Okay.
So what happened in this case, there were 6 astronauts on board, I should say 4 cosmonauts and 2 astronauts, I think technically. There was an American, a German, and 4 Russians. It's in 1997. And again, it's fairly routine. This was an oxygen generator. So what they used to have on the Mir space station, it was designed to normally have a crew of 3, and during handovers, sometimes up to 6, and that's the situation we were in February 97. And they used oxygen generators called Electron generators. They still use those today on the ISS.
Okay.
And they also have spares, which they called Vika, which was a slightly different method of producing oxygen. They used those as a backup for when they had a larger crew on board and they needed a little bit of extra oxygen capacity. And it was one of those Vika ones, one of those spares that burst into flames.
Oh, wow.
Exactly, yeah. So one of the cosmonauts was powering it up because they needed to get more oxygen, and it burst into flames. There were sparks. He talked about the sound, the hissing you'd normally get from the valve working correctly. Didn't seem quite right. Suddenly there were sparks, and then there was a 3-foot long flame coming out of it.
Oh my God, on the space station?
On the space station. I think this is absolutely terrifying.
Oh gosh.
Fire freaks me out down here at the best of times. Imagine that in an incredibly enclosed space, an oxygen-rich environment.
Yeah.
And what I think is even worse is that the location of this fire was blocking off access to one of the Soyuz capsules.
Which is their emergency craft.
escape. So if they had not been able to put out the fire and it was a disaster and they had to escape, 3 of them may not have made it. My guess is they would probably have tried to squeeze more into one Soyuz capsule, but that's not designed for that.
No.
So that doesn't bear thinking about. Now, fortunately, maybe this is part of the reason it's not so well known. They did deal with it. It burnt up. Apparently, the official line initially was burnt for a couple of minutes, a few seconds, both from the Russian and the American side.
Okay.
People from both sides have said it was about 14 minutes. They all agreed it was 14 minutes.
It's a longer period of time trying to put that out.
Very long period of time.
Okay.
They used 3 fire extinguishers. It did go out. But one of the things they said is that the smoke spread so quickly. And so this dense smoke
is just all over
filling the cabin. They couldn't see properly. One of the respirator masks the American astronaut was using, a guy called Jerry Lininger, he said initially it wasn't working properly. He had to use a different mask. So things like that. Imagine the panic you would feel
You
in that
can't
situation.
run is the issue, right? Like, there is nowhere to go. You are in that environment and you've got to deal with the issue that's in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely. So that, I think, is, fortunately, a happy ending. It sorted itself out. They managed to put it out. They stayed calm. But absolutely terrifying. I want to bring one Halloween element into this.
Okay.
There's a fascinating programme on BBC at the moment, BBC Two. It just started this week. It's called Once Upon a Time in Space, looking at various aspects of space travel. The one that was shown on Monday this week looked at the space shuttle astronauts being recruited in the 70s.
Okay.
And episode 2, which is going to be shown in the next few days, but is currently available on iPlayer, that's talking about Mir. And they are going to be talking about the fire. And so I learned I had a little sneak preview of that last night on iPlayer. I learned from that one of the cosmonauts on board, let me get his name, Alexander Lazutkin, apologies for my Russian pronunciation, before he flew to Mir for this mission, there was an astrologer for some reason at the Baikonur Cosmodrome where they were waiting to take off. And she was giving him all kinds of premonitions and things are going to go badly. And apparently they got a priest to come and baptize him before the mission. Now, I don't believe in astrology. I'm not religious either. I don't believe in all this.
Interesting.
All those kind of things of premonitions. But that's spooky. That gave me chills when I saw that.
A little bit of a coincidence.
Let's move on from that.
Don't know where to go from that, David. So I guess the neat kind of follow on from that is you're inside a spacesuit, you're inside a spacecraft, you're inside a space station. But what happens when you leave the vicinity of that and you are going on a spacewalk?
Yes.
So I want to talk about Alexei Leonov, who was a Soviet cosmonaut, and he was the first person ever to go on a spacewalk. So a spacewalk is
That's
when
scary in itself, isn't it? Being the first person to do something like that.
I can't imagine. I think it's scary enough thinking about going into space, to be inside your spacecraft or inside a space station, but then to actually leave the safety of that and go on a spacewalk when you're outside, of course, in your spacesuit, must be incredibly, incredibly scary.
And I mentioned just now the idea that a spacesuit is almost like a tiny spacecraft. It's designed to give you all those life support systems. But this is the very first time it had been done. They didn't know all this stuff necessarily. They were learning as they went.
Yeah, so of course they would have done a little bit of testing and kind of preempted what it would be like. And so Alexei Leonov was kind of suited and booted up. He left the hatch and he went out to do his EVA, his extravehicular activity, or his spacewalk. And he actually, he talked about, he says, you just can't comprehend it. Only out there you can feel greatness. So there is this sense
nice.
of just like, wow,
Sense
there
of
is
awe
nothing
at your
but space.
surroundings,
Exactly. But this is a mission that almost ended in disaster. And I can't imagine the panic that he would have been feeling. So I think he spent about 12 minutes outside. And they filmed the spacewalk in colour for full propaganda to make sure everyone knew that it happened. But what had happened, and what they probably hadn't preempted properly, is that when you're inside a spacecraft, you do have sort of roughly atmospheric pressure.
Yeah.
But when you then go outside into the vacuum of space, you don't have that same level of pressure. So what happened is his spacesuit, although already filled with a bit of pressure, then began to balloon. There wasn't enough pressure pushing back. He described it as feeling like the fabric of his spacesuit was being like stretched to a dangerous level. Like he was Marshmallow Man to the max, just super, super puffed up and inflated. And what they realised is
you make it sound so fun.
Well, he was probably in there panicking. From the outside, it probably looked quite comical. But he realised that as he was coming back to the hatch, he wasn't able to get back in. If you think about, some people who've had an injury sometimes get put into these like inflatable casts. And if you try and bend your arm within that pressurized kind of cast, you can't really bend your arm.
Yeah.
That's what he was facing, almost out there like a kind of stick figure man, not being able to move, not really being able to control where he was moving. And so what he had to do was open one of the valves to actually get rid of some of the air inside his suit.
That's terrifying.
That valve is there to keep the air in, and he's there opening the valve to let the air out. And the dexterity of the gloves to be able to do that with your own hands whilst your hand is also fully pressurized must have been incredibly difficult, and then to sort of close it off at the right time. He even talked about the fact that he was actually sweating so much in his suit that the liquid was pooling up inside his suit. And anyone who's heard of, even in recent day, ISS, International Space Station astronauts doing a spacewalk, when water comes inside your visor, it is a big deal.
And they bring them in immediately. Alexander Gerst, the German astronaut, had a situation where his water supply for drinking water burst a little bit, and a bit of water was coming out. They pulled him in immediately, didn't they? You don't want to have water. Basically acts very differently in space, and so once it gets to a surface, it almost kind of like sticks to that surface. If it sticks over your face, over your mouth and your nose, it's like being underwater. You cannot breathe. So very, very scary. He says eventually he managed to get back inside the spacecraft, but I can't even bear to imagine what that was like, to think that actually I'm here on the very first spacewalk. We don't know how this has been done before. I might not actually be able to get back inside the spacecraft. I think all three of those stories we've told so far really talk about the mental fortitude you need as an astronaut or a cosmonaut, and the recruitment process, looking for that kind of mental attitude, the ability to stay that calm under pressure. Because we've talked about 3 astronauts on Apollo 13, 6 astronauts and cosmonauts on the Mir fire situation, 1 in this case, Alexei Leonov. But in all of those cases, it's been solved by people acting very calmly, sticking with their training, knowing they might be about to die, and still being able to think calmly, act calmly, just deal with those situations. It's not something I can imagine ever being able to do.
No, and in no way do I mean to undermine how scary this would have been, but Alexei Leonov was tethered, which means that he was attached to his spacecraft the entire time. But actually, there is an astronaut and several astronauts who have gone one step further.
Yeah.
So Bruce McCandless became the first person to do an untethered spacewalk. I think it was in the 1980s.
I think it was late 80s, mid to late 80s.
He used what was essentially like a jetpack to move about 100 meters away from the space shuttle in which he'd gone up. There is a picture of Bruce McCandless just in the darkness of space with nothing connecting him to the spacecraft. That is another level of, if you're lost out there in space, there is no hope of anyone trying to get you back. But actually, these jetpacks, these machines were actually devised as emergency ways of astronauts being able to return to their spacecraft if any of those kind of precautions had failed. So if a tether had broken, having something like a jetpack would mean an astronaut could get back. And actually, whilst those untethered spacewalks are no longer done, there was the development of something, I believe it was called SAFER. It's an acronym for a mini jetpack version, and basically all astronauts on the ISS who are doing EVAs actually have this device on the back of their backpack. It's not used to do untethered spacewalks, but if there's ever a reason that all their precautions fail and they get separated from their spacecraft, there's no vehicle that can bring them back, they have this ability. So there was a reason for doing it, and 6 astronauts, I believe, did an untethered spacewalk. Crazy people. But it provided a safety mechanism which we still use today.
Again, we've learned from things that in that case, not a disaster. They were trying out something which we still use as a backup today. Great idea.
So we've covered a few different things in terms of dangers in space, but this is our kind of spooky Halloween episode. So is there anything kind of astronomically speaking that you find quite spooky, weird, wonderful, or mysterious?
Yeah, I've got one I'm going to talk about. I think this will probably be slightly briefer than the others we've done so far. There's all kinds of spooky things in space, or not necessarily spooky, but things that are mysterious and strange. Black holes is the classic example. Just objects that it's so hard for us to comprehend. And actually, in the last 100 years or so, we've found a lot more of these kind of things and been able to detect them. Because in the past, in the early years of astronomy, it was just look with your eyes, use a telescope, visible light. If you couldn't see something, we couldn't really detect it. And then now we've got radio telescopes and the ability to look in different ways. We've talked about infrared, James Webb.
So these different types of light we have the ability to now see.
And these different radio waves and signals that we can detect and learn a lot about these kind of things. So this is one example of something like that. I think it's a very weird kind of object. They're called pulsars.
Okay.
So these are basically special kinds of neutron stars. Neutron stars themselves are quite weird. They are very small and dense. They're kind of the mass of a star, but in a size of about 10 to 20 kilometres usually.
So like the leftover dead core of a star.
Exactly. They're kind of left over after supernovas quite often. It's kind of like a halfway house to a black hole almost.
Not quite dense enough,
Exactly,
but incredibly dense
incredibly
nonetheless.
Weird, incredibly dense. They give off some radiation. They spin. There's a lot of spin on these things. And if they have a magnetic field, which some of them do, then they give off quite powerful bursts of radio waves.
I like to think of it a bit like an ice skater, right? So if you're an ice skater with your arms out and you start spinning, but the more and more you compact and bring your arms in, the faster you spin.
So all the spin you had on that star, as it gets compacted into a neutron star, it spins faster and faster. Fantastic analogy. It's exactly how it works.
Okay.
In this case, spinning neutron star with a strong magnetic field, giving off these very powerful radio waves in a very particular direction.
So like
basically
jets?
Jets almost, basically coming out of the two poles of the star.
Okay.
And these are what we know as pulsars.
Okay.
So these were first discovered in 1967 by a PhD student called Jocelyn Bell. Now, the signal from these comes as a very, very regular pulse, hence the name pulsar.
Okay.
You can think of it like a lighthouse beam. So the lighthouse beam spinning round, we only see it coming, the bright light in our eyes when it's pointing straight towards us.
So that's why, although all neutron stars spin, we don't always see them all as pulsars because that jet might not be coming towards the Earth.
And it's the ones with a very powerful magnetic field that give such a powerful burst, and only when that spinning beam is pointing towards the Earth, that's when we see it.
Your pulse. Okay.
So we get a very, very, extremely regular pulse of radio waves.
Okay.
So that's what was spotted. A very faint signal from somewhere in deep space, and very, very regular, every 1.3 seconds or so.
Okay.
A little extra bit of
radio waves.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of their first thoughts, I don't think they thought that this was necessarily seriously the case, but it's a nice little Halloween-y tie-in. They thought this could be a signal from an alien civilization.
Okay.
Because something so regular doesn't feel natural. It feels like, well, maybe this is a signal, the sort of thing we might send out if we were trying to communicate to someone else out there. So their code name for this object they discovered was LGM1.
Okay.
Little Green Men. Which I think is a lovely touch. So
aliens are green.
Of course they are. So that's a concept. It could have been aliens. Now, fairly quickly, a few months later, as part of her studies after that, she was then studying all kinds of parts of the sky and found more of these signals. So I think 4 months later, she found a second one. That pretty much put paid to that. You're not going to have lots of places across the universe
doing the same
all sending
thing.
It. Exactly.
Okay.
And eventually they worked out that that's what was going on. And this actually confirmed a hypothesis from about 30 years earlier of this kind of neutron star. So I think it's an observation. It says a lot about how we are able to observe things, confirm theoretical ideas. But I like the little alien tie-in, so I thought I'd include it. And they are very, very strange objects.
Yeah, it's an incredible story as well about, Jocelyn Bell and the work that she did on that. But actually, maybe we can end on one more kind of alien story for our spooky Halloween episode. So have you heard of the story of the Solway spaceman?
Now, I've heard the phrase because you mentioned you were going to talk about it, but I intentionally haven't looked up anything about it because, no, I know nothing.
Well, this story you may have heard a little bit about just because there is a little tenuous link to the Space Centre, and I'll get onto that in a little while. But essentially, this story takes us back to the 1960s, and there was a fireman from Carlisle, so just an ordinary man.
Okay.
His name was Jim Templeton. So he loved to go on outings with his wife and his daughter, and on this particular lovely summer's day, they decided to go out on a normal outing to a place called Burr Marsh, which is overlooking the Solway Firth in Cumbria.
Okay.
Now, he had taken his camera with him, and his daughter was dressed in a lovely new dress, and so he wanted to take some lovely pictures of her in this brand new dress on the Firth. And he says that on the day, it wasn't very busy at all. So it was him, his wife, his daughter, and he saw just 2 other pensioners sitting in their car. So it wasn't a busy park or anything
deserted.
like that. Yeah, nobody else there. So he took some beautiful pictures of his daughter. Now, you and I live in an age where everything is instant, right? So we take a picture on our phone and there it is. We can see whether we're smiling or whether our eyes were closed. But back in the 1960s, they had to get their camera film developed and get those pictures.
I remember that. Not the 60s, but I remember those days.
Do you, David?
Not quite the 60s.
So, they had to wait a few days to get their pictures back. So he took it to the Kodak store and he got them to develop their camera film. And when it came back a few days later, he'd been telling the guy at the counter, I'm really looking forward to seeing these pictures. And the chemist there said, oh, well, one of your pictures has been photobombed. And he was like, wait, what? So he had a look at the photo, and it's a lovely picture of his daughter, and hopefully producer Lucy can put the picture up so everyone can see. But there was a figure standing behind his daughter that looked like a spaceman.
I was wondering whether Spaceman was going to come in. That makes more sense. Okay.
We're in the middle of Cumbria, like nobody else is there, and there is a spaceman standing behind his daughter. Now, he claims the 2 pensioners were in their car.
Okay.
Nobody else was around. His wife was standing behind him, so she wasn't in the photo. Yet there was clearly a figure. And, of course, back in the 1960s, the clarity of images probably wasn't the best, but it's enough to see there's a figure there. Now, he went to the police and he was like, look what's happened. Like, what is this? And they were like, it's nothing extraordinary. He actually told the guys at Kodak, like, what is this? And they actually put out a reward. If anyone could show that this photo had been, like, faked or forged, they'd give out a reward. Never claimed. He even goes to say, Jim, that 2 men in black turned up at his home. And this is after it caught a lot of media attention. And they told him, like, can you take us to the site of where this happened?
So they were maybe even taking it
So
seriously.
Things were, getting a little bit like, what's going on here? And the strangest link of all, and this is how it relates back to the Space Centre, is that it was linked to the launch of a Blue Streak missile launch. So anyone that's been to the Space Centre and has seen our rocket tower knows that we've got 2 rockets in there. One of them is the Blue Streak. And that missile was being launched in Woomera in Australia. So halfway across the world.
But at about the same time.
About the same time.
That's
so
spooky.
Days after he took the photograph, the Blue Streak missile test was aborted. And some of the technicians say that they saw 2 figures standing by the launch pad. And they basically, like, cancelled the test. So the fact that there's this kind of like tenuous link to something halfway across the world, and the fact that Blue Streak was actually built at the RAF Space Dam in Cumbria, there's like a weird, mysterious thing, going on here.
Mysterious. Like I said earlier, I don't believe in all this sort of stuff, but that's given me the chills.
It's just so coincidental, and it caused like international media frenzy, and this story still hasn't really been solved today. People are still talking about it. So the story gathered momentum. There was even some people saying that they spotted like a UFO sighting near the Woomera launch as well. Eventually it turned out that was a camera lens flare. So sometimes if you're taking a picture and you've got like dust or water quite near your camera lens, the bright light from a flash can cause that to create a little lens flare. And in this case, that's what had created what appeared look like a UFO. But although that could be discredited, nobody else really had any images of those 2 spacemen at Woomera. Like, we don't know what was going on. The one possibility that still stands today, but Jim says, no, she wasn't there, is that his wife may have actually been standing behind their daughter while the photo was being taken. And this is a theory, because when we look at a picture or other pictures taken from the day, you can see his wife dressed in a sort of pale blue dress, and she had like long sleeves on that dress as well. And the idea is that because of the type of camera he was using at the time, the light of her kind of light blue dress may have appeared more white in colour. And again, hopefully Lucy can put this picture up, our producer, and you can see that maybe it could have been his wife. And actually, you know, the cameras of that time as well, you wouldn't be able to see the entire frame. What you'd see is about 70% of the frame.
Yeah.
So it could be that he only really saw his daughter in the frame and not his wife in the background. But he still claims that his wife was behind him. So the Solway spaceman is still, you know, a debated, is it a UFO? Is it a spaceman? Like, we don't know what's going on. It could well just be his wife, though.
Yeah, that's a pretty spooky way for us to finish on that. I'm going to choose to believe it was his wife because the other possibilities freak me out a little bit too much. So, as ever, we want to try and find ways for you to get engaged in space. We're doing it a little bit differently this time. Because it's Halloween, we thought we would focus on some nebulas. Nebulas, as you probably know, clouds of dust and gas out in space. Quite hard to spot. You will need quite a powerful telescope to spot these, but bear in mind, Charles Messier, who found a lot of these objects in the sky, your telescope at home is probably more powerful than his. So you probably will be able to spot a nebula or two. Be patient. Don't expect to see images quite as clear as you'd get from things like the Hubble Space Telescope, but you can, if you know where you're looking, find little fuzzy objects and you might be able to spot a nebula. We thought we'd pick out a few nebulas that have Halloween-y themes because there's quite a few interesting shaped nebulas.
Yes.
So we've just picked out 2 or 3 each. My favourite's the Ghost Head Nebula.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I love the Cat's Eye Nebula. So
Cat's
it
Eye's
really
beautiful.
does, have that kind of cat eye shape.
Also the Tarantula Nebula. I'm not convinced it's the right shape, but it's lots of sort of spreading out bits of light. That's quite a good spooky Halloween one.
Nice. I'm going a bit wizardy here. So like the Owl Nebula, lovely kind of round nebula with the look of the owl's face.
And my final one, the Witch Head. And you really can see the pointy nose. It's excellent.
And I guess one more is the Skull Nebula, kind of spooky one for you to try and spot. But like David says, some of these can be kind of difficult.
Yeah.
So, you know, you'll need a good telescope. You'll know exactly where to look. But there are some naked eye things that we can look for too.
Yeah, there are. And just our final one to time with Halloween. It's a star in the Perseus constellation. It's called Algol, known as the Demon Star. So you can see this with the naked eye, but the thing about this star, it's actually a binary star system, technically 3 stars,
Okay.
2 major ones, a binary star system, 2 stars orbiting each other. But what happens is they go in front of each other with this orbit. It's lined up nicely with the Earth. So when the dimmer star goes in front of the brighter one, the whole system as we see as this object in the sky dims.
Okay.
So it appears to wink, and it happens every 3 days for about 10 hours. So the
A winking star.
Exactly. A winking star. And we're not sure if this was originally intended, but it's often now viewed as Medusa's eye, Medusa's winking eye.
Okay.
Because the constellation of Perseus, he is holding the head of Medusa, the Gorgon from Greek mythology. And so often these days, the demon star is portrayed as the winking eye of Medusa.
Something cool to look out for then.
Cool and creepy. So that's one you can see with the naked eye. You might not spot the winking because it takes that long period of 3 days, but a spooky star for us to finish.
So thank you all for listening and joining us. And if you want to see some of the visuals, make sure you head on to YouTube. But thank you, David.
Thank you, Tara.
And we hope you will have a spooky Halloween.
And as ever, we want to know what you want to know. We like to do mailbag episodes where we try and answer your questions. So if you do have any interesting space questions for us, please send them in to us at podcast@spacecentre.co.uk. Or, of course, you can leave a comment on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you in a couple of weeks for the next episode of Space Now.